Hello, good morning. Today we are going to continue learning about the civil rights movement, but this time we are going to cover the other movements that followed after the African American civil rights movement. So let's go ahead and start our lesson today. All right, here we are. So, like I said, like you guys have been learning, the African American Civil Rights Movement was in the 1950s and 60s. And then that basically encouraged other groups of people, other minority groups, to kick off their own movement because there was a lot realized that there were a lot of groups that in our country did not have equal rights, civil rights as well. So we have three groups of people that we're going to talk about today that had their own movements that started in the late 60s and throughout the 70s. So we have Latinos, you can say Hispanics, and then you have American Indians, which are Native Americans in the United States. And then we have women, all right? So these three groups all had their own movement in the 1960s and 70s. Okay. So let's go ahead and look at this. Yes, I have a question really early. So you have the African American Civil Rights Movement. And like I said, that inspired other groups, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, or you can say Hispanics, and then women to all fight for their rights. Now, can you think of another group that is still fighting for rights today? And I can think of a few groups actually. But I don't want to give you the answers because I know you guys know, and I know you guys can think of it. Excuse me, I have the hiccups. Okay, so go ahead and answer right here. If you can think of other groups that are fighting for rights, have been discriminated on, and basically they're barely beginning their movement. All right, next topic, affirmative action. So affirmative action is an idea that was adopted by a lot of places, a lot of countries, and a lot of various facilities, organizations, anything you think of, began to implement this idea of affirmative action in the 1960s and after. So what this is, affirmative action means there are programs that are created to increase minority representation. So due to the civil rights movement that was going on, like I said, there was a lot of realization that minorities, African Americans, women, different groups, they are not being given fair opportunities, equal opportunities like the rest of the country. Like maybe they're not being given the same opportunities as whites. And to ensure that minorities are given the same opportunities as whites, that affirmative action was implemented in a lot of places. So it's a quota system that basically reserves participation for minority groups. So for an example, you have universities, to ensure that Blacks are being allowed to be enrolled into colleges, universities, to ensure that Asians, to ensure that Indians, Native Americans, to ensure that women and other groups, Hispanics, are being given the same opportunity as whites. There is a certain quota or a percentage that allows them to participate. Like for an example, say they're gonna, universities are going to allow, at least 10% of all the people that they're going to accept into their college or university for that school year, at least 10% will be reserved for, Asians, maybe 20% for Hispanics. You know what I mean? Like, so that is to ensure that everyone's getting the opportunity. And, like, just in case these places get audited by the federal government, because the federal government wants to make sure that there isn't any discrimination going on, at least the facility can be like, well, this is how many people we are allowing of each group minimum. We're allowing, you know what I mean? We're accepting all groups. This is to show you that we really are doing that. We're not discriminating. We're not just only accepting, certain groups. So businesses also adopt this. Employers, they also want to show proof that they're not discriminating on minority groups. So they make sure that they try to balance employment out and that there's diversity in the workplace. So that's affirmative action. So it was adopted after the civil rights movement just to ensure that, or just to show that, they are allowing, like I said, minorities opportunities like everyone else. So it's now some places still adopt this today. They still have this idea of affirmative action. And some people say it's unfair, and some people say it's necessary. Like I said, this is to prevent discrimination and to ensure that everyone has opportunities. And that way there's no such thing as like white privilege, like, oh, that person got the job because they were white. Maybe if I were white, I would have gotten the job. Like, they're trying to eliminate that idea. But think about how it is today. Do you think that places still need to adopt affirmative action, that they need to reserve certain positions for certain groups in jobs, in schools, just because you don't want to see any discrimination going on? So this can kind of like prove it. Do you think it's still necessary today, or do you think it should be based off of qualifications? Like, it doesn't matter what race you are. If you're the most qualified candidate for the job, or if you have the best scores for this university to be accepted, then you should be accepted. It shouldn't matter if you're Black or if you're white or if you're Hispanic, things like that. Now, there was a very controversial story that came out a few years ago about a girl who really wanted to get accepted into a university, and she was white, and she had kept applying at this university. They kept rejecting her, and on her application, after I think the third time of being rejected, on her application she put that she was African American, and then she was accepted. So, you know what I mean? That's just to give you an idea of how affirmative action works. And now, not all places adopt this, but a lot of places still do. Okay, the Chicano movement, led by Latinos or Hispanics. So the Chicano movement first started off with, let's see, the famous Cesar Chavez. Many of you guys are familiar with Cesar Chavez or Cesar Chavez. There's a lot of, I've seen a lot of streets in Texas, in different cities, that have a street named after Cesar Chavez, right? So we have one in downtown San Antonio. There's one in Austin, a street, like I said, or a road named after him. So who was he? He was a Mexican-American farm worker. He worked out in the fields, and back in the day, even today, it's still very common. You pass by a field, a cabbage field, a strawberry field or something, and you see a lot of Hispanics picking, produce, picking crops. They've been hired to do this, right? And that's how our grocery stores get the crops. They come from them. So he was a Mexican-American farm worker who started his own union. And as you guys should know what a union is, it's, an organization of workers who come together and they're there to fight for rights. Like, there's teacher unions, there's police unions, there's registered nurse unions, there's all types of unions that are there for protection. just to ensure that there isn't any unfairness going on. So he started his own union, and it's called the Union of Farm Workers, the UFW, and it was specifically for farm workers. Now, most farm workers were Hispanics at this time in the 70s, 80s, and and like I said, even till today, you guys might know some migrant workers. You might have friends that are migrants. So he represented that group, and back in the day, a lot of these farm workers were taken advantage of. They were forced to work long hours, no lunch breaks. They weren't allowed to really get breaks, period. Their pay was horrible. It was like change. It wasn't even like official, like $2 an hour, things like that. Sometimes it was based off of the amount of labor you did, how many products, how many produce you picked in a basket, it's weighed, and like and still like it could be change that you're getting paid for. So it was very unfair. They were forced to work during harsh working conditions and just not given any rights. So he fought for their rights. And one of his tactics that he used was strikes and boycotts. So strikes would be like, where you stop working, and a lot of farm workers were part of his union, and he would say, all right, they don't want to give us a raise, they don't want to at least give us $1 an hour, we're going to go on strike, nobody's going to go into work tomorrow, and they need us, they rely on us to pick crops, to pick produce. They can't function as a business without their workers, right? Grocery stores are depending on them to deliver produce. So with a strike, they will give us the pay that we need, or they will meet our demands, period, right? So that's what he did, and he made a lot of progress, and he's very, very famous, known in California and here in Texas, wherever there's a big group of migrant workers. All right, so Dolores Huerta was also a partner in the UFW with Cesar Chavez. So she also was really big in fighting for better working conditions and better pay, and also helping families out. A lot of workers were illegal immigrants, and she did her best to try to see if she can help them and give them the same benefits that other Americans had. So she was a voice for them. She represented them in many different ways. Okay, so here, like I said, is the UFW, the United Farm Workers Organization Committee, or Union of Farm Workers. And like I said, what they stand for. All right, we have Hector P. Garcia. So Hector P. Garcia founded the American GI Forum, which was, well, first of all, he was a Mexican-American doctor. He served in World War II as a veteran, he was. And then he was also a civil rights advocate for Hispanics. So he knew that there was a lot of discrimination going on with Hispanics. Like veterans at this time they weren't being treated fairly. There was a lot of criticism, especially after the Vietnam War. So he tries to fight for their rights. But the Hispanics, because Hispanics were discriminated even more, even though there were a lot of Hispanic veterans. So that's what the American GI Forum does. It represents Hispanic veterans and just tries to get them services and anything that they need. All right, so Hispanic veterans, a civil rights organization for them. And it's legal, like it's a legal organization. They fight it's kind of like the NAACP, but for Hispanics. Okay, question 47. Whose rights did Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta fight for? Did they fight for illegal immigrants seeking citizenship, Mexican students wanting to go to college, or Hispanic farm workers? All right, and you know the answer, Hispanic farm workers, right? Think of the UFW, what that stands for. What was the purpose of the UFW? What were they fighting for? So they were fighting for better working conditions and better pay for farm workers. All right, but the American Indian Movement, which is AIM, and this is for Native Americans. So as you guys know, Native Americans have been discriminated on for the longest time. We've learned so much about Native Americans at the beginning of the school year. You know that they have had their land taken away from them. They were not allowed to have citizenship for a very long time. They were, a lot of them were brutally murdered, forced onto reservations. Reservations were unsanitary. So this was formed to help them basically fight for rights and basically fight for their territory. So today, because of them, and they're very militant though. That's why you see bullet holes on this car. They arm themselves. And the reservations, Native American reservations, basically they have full control of their own reservations. They have their own laws. And, it's kind of like a country within a country, like for Native Americans. And they like to be left alone. And they're very defensive. And I mean, that's how they are. But they've had to basically turn to this idea of being militant because they were tired of being taken advantage of. So they, they're anything that has to do with Native Americans, AIM is there to represent them. And, like I said, it is militant also. So, but there, some of the effects of this would be there's a lot of crime on these reservations, a lot of poverty also, and other things. But they want to be kept alone and they don't want to be taken advantage of and they want to be respected. Question 49, why do you think Native Americans felt the need to form AIM? Think about their history. So I talked about it, that they've been discriminated all throughout history. They've had land taken away. They've had their rights they didn't have equal rights for a very long time. Like they weren't given their rights till the 1920s, 1924 is when they got citizenship. And people always disregard Native American land. And especially if there's like oil found there, like there's always a lot of trespassing, and they felt the need to organize and to defend themselves and defend their land. All right, the feminist movement. I have to go quickly. So women fight for equality. So there was a feminist movement that happened, which is the women's rights movement. Well, not the women's rights movement, because that gets confused with like the late 1800s, early 1900s. But there was a movement in which women felt the need, to fight for true economic, political, and social equality with men. So the leader of this was Betty Friedan. She wrote the book, The Feminine Mystique, which sometimes excerpts come out on the state exam. And she had, think about what women went through for a very long time. Like the obstacles that they've gone through, the hurdles. They weren't given the right to vote, women, till the 1920s, till 1920. Oh, can you hold 1 second? And I'll call you in a little bit. Okay. Women, think about it. They weren't given the right to vote till around 1919, 1920, right, with the 19th Amendment. And then they started to break out and become free and live their own lives and break traditional roles in the 1920s with the Roaring 20s. And then a lot of them were working, right? Think of World War I, World War II. They were taking on men's jobs and contributing to the war effort. And then after World War II, things start to kind of reverse and change. And, women were expected to marry young and have kids right away and stay at home and not work and take care of the families and cook and clean and just be a traditional housewife. And it was frowned upon if they worked because men are supposed to be the breadwinners. They're the ones that are supposed to make the money for the family and take care of the family. So that was that kind of changed things, the 1950s and then the 60s. And then she tries to bring that realization back to the country and to the world that women, you know, need to be strong and be able to live their life. And it's time to break these gender roles. Women want to work. Women want to do their own thing. They don't want to be traditional, and they want to be independent, and they want to be equal, and they want to be able to find a job and not be discriminated on because they're a woman. And they want to be able to get equal pay, and they want to be able to own property, and, you know, a lot of other things. There's so much realization that was brought to light with the feminist movement. So that's what she does. She writes a book talking about that. And it was a huge, huge movement in the late 1960s, early 1970s. All right, so question 50. Think about the history of women in the last century, which is the last 100 years. How has it changed? How has women's history changed? I just kind of gave you a little brief, timeline of how history has changed for women from the 1800s to the 1920s and the 30s and 40s and 50s and then today. So give me a couple of examples comparing how it was before the feminist movement and how things are today after the feminist movement. Are we still very traditional? Do we still have these traditional roles? I know some of you guys might come from families where it is still very traditional, and but it's not as the way it was before the feminist movement, right? So much has changed. So think about that and just write some things down, and that is it. So I kind of have to stop here. All right, that is it. We're done with the entire civil rights movement. Have a great day. And I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.